Thank you for joining us for Minnesota Matters. I'm Tess Rice, MBA's General Counsel. Today, Teresa is going to talk about the elections and their potential impact on Minnesota banks. And then Tom Boswell-Healy is going to talk a little bit about banking non-U.S. citizens. If you have questions for either of them, please put them in the chat and I will get those questions to them. This webinar will be recorded and will be put on our YouTube channel. Teresa, take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tess. Good morning, everyone. We are 1 week out from the elections, and I believe a lot of the results were very not expected, I think is what the best way to say it. But I'm going to put up a PowerPoint slideshow and go through some of the results and kind of how the impacts Minnesota. But all in all, I think it was a great result for Minnesota. But let's take a look here. So 2024 election results, and what does it mean for Minnesota? Trump wins. This obviously is huge for the country, but it also had really big impacts in Minnesota with former president and now president-elect Trump winning. That sent Governor Walz back to Minnesota. If you recall, a lot of our conversations over the last couple of months have been what would happen if a Harris-Walz ticket became the president and vice president, and just kind of the trickle down of what was going to happen. So we obviously speculated for months that if he became vice president, you know, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan would be elevated to governor, and then what would happen with the Senate president moving to lieutenant governor, and then you'd have, you know, back to a 33-33 tie, and just kind of, you know, and then we had heard that Peggy Flanagan would be able to reappoint all new commissioners, and what would that mean for the state? And so a lot of it really kind of was like a lot of, you know, just really looking at what could possibly have happened if a Harris-Walz ticket would have won the presidency. And so obviously that did not happen. So nothing changes, and Walz has returned back to Minnesota for this final 2 years as governor. What he chooses to do beyond that will remain to be seen. I think the next 2 years will really play a role in kind of what his intentions are, whether he, you know, tries to run for governor again in 2 years, or whether he tries, you know, after getting a taste of the national spotlight, wants to do something more national again. Back to Minnesota for Governor Walz. Just to kind of look at the Minnesota legislature and just kind of how, you know, we've always said that the MBA has really kind of worked in every kind of scenario at the Capitol. And this kind of really shows kind of what we've worked through. If you look at this slide, the only scenario that has not happened, I don't know if it's ever happened, definitely not in my time, is a complete GOP, House, Senate, and governor. I think, you know, when I first started working in politics, that 2001, 2002 was the scenario I was currently working in, but I was at the House of Representatives at that point. But we've worked kind of in a lot of different, a lot of different kind of setups in Minnesota. And so knowing that we could work in any kind of situation, we kind of were hopeful as to what the results would be this year. Right, a reminder, the Senate was not up for re-election this year. The House was the only thing that was on the ballots, except for one Senate seat, and then the governor. So what is Governor Walz returning to? Governor Walz is now returning to a very divided House. And that is what we found last week. So it's the Minnesota Senate. As I just said, they were not up for re-election this year. They are on a 4-4-2. So every in 2002 or 22, they were elected for 4 years. In 26, they'll be elected for 4 years. And then in 2030, they'll be elected for 2 years. So they were not up for re-election. The Democrats have had a 34-33 majority the past 2 years. Senator Kelly Morrison from Deep Haven decided to resign in June to run for Dean Phillips' congressional seat. And so and just based off of the timing of her resignation, that put her seat on the November ballot, which was definitely going to be better for Democrats in that seat. That special election was last week, and former Senator Ann Johnson Stewart beat Kathleen Falk. So we are back to a 34 to 33 majority. If you look at that district, I think in the end, there probably was about $2 million spent on that race. Because again, it determined the majority in the Senate. One thing of note is one side of the district, Andrew Myers, the Republican, won that side of the district by 10 points. The other side of that district, Patty Acom is a Democrat and she won, but she also ran unopposed. And I think that was probably one of the biggest misses for the House Republicans, was not having any candidate, and for the Senate Republicans not having a candidate running in that side of the seat for the Republicans, because that was definitely a seat that maybe would have still went to Ann Johnson Stewart. But I think having, some kind of action on the B side of that district would definitely have helped Republicans possibly get closer in that special election. So Senate leadership, there were no changes in Senate leadership. We believe that Senator Aaron Murphy will continue as the caucus leader. For the Senate Republicans, Mark Johnson will continue as minority leader. And I think they just kind of had a little bit of a shakeup. A couple of those may have changed kind of as his deputies to round out their leadership team. All great senators. So again, we're back to a 34 to 33 Senate DFL majority. So very tight once again. So don't expect much to change in the Senate. Minnesota House.
Wait, Teresa, can we talk about what could change in the Senate?
Yes. So the one thing that does, so as what Tess is kind of pointing out, is that if you recall back in April of last year, the Woodbury Senator, Nicole Mitchell, took a drive up to Detroit Lakes and is now still awaiting her trial date for alleged burglary into her stepmom's house. So what could possibly happen, there were a number of times where her seat was, or her trial, her court case kept coming up, but it kept getting delayed. So as of right now, it is set for the end of January. If, she's back on Twitter, she's back out, really kind of putting herself back out there again. I think regardless, I think there will still be issues. The ethics committee has not met because nothing has really changed, to see what the ethics committee wants to do in that seat and with her. But that is definitely one that everybody's watching, because again, if something happens where she has to resign or whether she is removed from the Senate, that would obviously cause a special election at some point next session.
So do you know if she is actually, let's say she pleads to some lesser charge, which is kind of what I expect, then there would be an ethics hearing, do you think?
I think there might still be an ethics hearing. I think that because unfortunately, there's been a number of legislators that have had, drunk driving, they've been guilty on various charges. And I don't know that many of them have ever really, I think a lot of people have resigned over the years, versus kind of really having anything legally, go against them.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like her resigning is something that she's going to be willing to do.
Yeah, and the ethics committee is 2 and 2, so 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. So, so whether it ends up having to come to a floor vote again, as we saw last year, the Senate majority was willing to allow her to vote because they needed the one vote. And so, last year, to get everything through, nobody asked for her to resign until after all of her votes were needed. And they did, a lot of senators did push for her resignation, again, around that June filing deadline to try and get her seat on the ballot, but she was not going to give in to them. So I don't foresee her resigning on her own.
Okay.
So now to the House. The House is obviously where all the play was this year. The Democrats have held the majority in the House since 2018. We had a they had the majority going into this election with a 70-64 majority. So last week, the Republicans were able to pick up 3 seats, which now puts us at a 67-67 tie. The last time we had a 67-67 tie was in 1979. If you saw the political insight that went out last week, there was an article from Session Daily, which is the House Information Media Department, and they really looked back at that 1979 session and how that worked, and I'll get into that in a couple of slides. So last week after the elections, okay, so back to that. So there's 67-67. There are 2 seats that are still out for recount. 1 seat was in St. Cloud, and 1 seat is in Shakopee. The 2 important things about both of these seats were, at one point on election night, with 100% reporting, the Republicans had won. So they had posted on the Secretary of State's page, there was 100% reporting, and in the St. Cloud seat, Sue Eck had won by 4 votes, and in the Shakopee seat, Aaron Paul had won by a significant number of votes. When I refreshed my page in the St. Cloud seat, that number changed from Sue Eck winning by 4 votes to Dan Wolgamount winning by 28 votes. So as of that night, then Wolgamount went up by 28 votes. And then in the Shakopee seat, at one point that night, the Aaron Paul and Brad Tabke votes were actually erased. And so somewhere in the middle of the night, a new number popped up and had Brad Tabke winning by 13 votes. He won by 13 votes. So that night, those 2 seats, which were both in the Republican win category, ended up flipping to the Democrat win category. Both of them are within the margin of recount. Since that time, that St. Cloud seat has now been increased to 191 votes. So at some point, Stearns County found some other votes. And so that one, they are going to, now that it is outside of the error of the margin for recount, they have asked the Secretary of State's office to do those ones by hand count. So they, at their own expense, will do recounts. And then in the Tabke seat, I think they found a couple more votes, and it's 14 votes. So they will have a hand recount on there as well. I've never seen in my years a recount that has changed. So we definitely do go into this session, I believe, with a 67-67 tie. So to kind of look at the House leadership, Melissa Hortman has been speaker since 2018. She will remain as their speaker designate. And then, Jamie Long, Athena Hollins, and Lish Kozlowski will be there to support her. House Republicans, Lisa Dameth has been the minority leader the last couple of years. She is their speaker designate. Harry Niska, who we have worked really well with because he has sat on the Commerce Committee and the Judiciary Civil Law Committee. He is an attorney, will be their deputy caucus leader. Great addition for the House Republicans. So we have 2 speaker designates. Now what? So Hortman and Dameth must now negotiate a power sharing agreement. As I mentioned, the only other time that there was a 67-67 tie was in 1979. I think by statute, you can only have 1 speaker. So it is going to be a couple months, I think, of trying to figure out how you share that power. And that was why I think a lot of people went back to that 1979 article. The article was written in 2020, I believe, because over the years during elections, we've always talked about what would happen with a 67-67 tie. And now we are back there again. And what they ended up doing was they gave the Republicans the speaker, and then they ended up giving some of the powerful committee chairs to the Democrats. But when you're in the majority, you dictate how many people are on these committees, and oftentimes it's never rationed with the majority minority. So now you're gonna have a 50-50 split. So everything that comes up is probably gonna have to be negotiated. And you're gonna have to see a lot more bipartisan stuff. So here is what Minnesota looks like. We have 67-67 in the House, and then in the Senate we have 34-33. So I don't think you can get any more purple than that. So if you look at the 201 legislators, you have 101 Democrats and 100 Republicans. And that is going to be complete split. So then you also bring, obviously, Governor Walz into the mix as well. The last 2 years, there has been very little need for the minority caucuses to vote with the majority. The only time that the only time that they've really needed the minority is for a bonding bill, and that did not happen last year. There's a lot of hurt feelings after the end of last session. It was a very chaotic session. I think in the last 2 years, the minorities have felt that they have just kind of been quieted and muted. So trying to figure out how to power share the next 2 years is going to be a very interesting and hard task for everybody involved. Some of the fun facts, so 67 DFLers, so 57 of the 67 have never served in the minority. So they've never served in the minority, which means they don't know what it's like to actually have to compromise. And what we have found the last couple of years, you look at paid family medical leave, you look at the cannabis bill, you look at any number of the legislation that came up, a lot of things were always discussed that we will have conversations and we'll fix them along the way, but bills just were never fixed. And so a lot of these members have not had to really compromise with the minority. So it's going to be a rude awakening for a lot of legislators that, it's not going to be as easy. 22 new members, so 16% will be new. 3 seats that the Republicans picked up were in North Mankato, Winona, and the Iron Range. 2 of those were open. The Winona seat and the Iron Range seat were both open this year. The North Mankato seat was the only incumbent to lose. So Republicans held on to every one of their seats. So 2025 session, what's going to happen? And Tess is going to talk a little bit of some of the issues that could possibly pop up. But for the most part, they just have to balance the budget. That has to, statutorily has to be done. The end of session is May 19th next year. We haven't seen a balanced budget done on time. So I expect that we'll probably, going to put it out there, they will probably be back in June for a special session, as they have to have that done by June 30th. So maybe a bonding bill, but for the most part, anything I think that you see come up next year will have to be balanced and it will have to be negotiated. So some of the legislative dates. So the first day of session is the 14th. The governor's budget is due on the 28th of January. Bank Day is going to be on February 11th. Carla is going to drop the link into the chat. So that registration is now open. February forecast will come out at the end of February. Constitutional last day is on the 19th, but they have to be done by June 30th. And then just a couple of things. Nothing changes congressionally in Minnesota. Klobuchar beat Royce White. The only new member for Minnesota's congressional district is Kelly Morrison. She took over for Dean Phillips. That was an easy win for her, but those are all stay the same. And then just kind of U.S. House and U.S. Senate, we are still waiting for a lot of those seats to be called. But the Republicans did flip the U.S. Senate. So they're currently sitting at a 52-46. 2 seats yet to be called in Pennsylvania and Nevada. Senate Banking Chair Sherrod Brown lost. So I believe Tim Scott will become the Senate Banking Chair next year. A whole lot of discussions on who will be the majority leader in the Senate now. Republicans will likely keep the House. They're the very slim majority. They have to have 218. They're currently sitting at 214, 16 yet to be called. I think I counted about 6 or 7 that are fairly Republican at this point. So that, again, that's going to be really tough for the Democrats. So we could see a one-party system. And I think the one thing that we're all very hopeful with a Trump presidency is just kind of what the regulators, there'll be a turnover of regulators, and, the top of the CFPB will change, and we'll see some other changes as well. And I think we're all hopeful that is good things for the banking industry. So that is my update.
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, ABA did a webinar on Friday. Maybe some of you saw that, talking about what the elections mean at the federal level. And as Teresa said, of course, the CFPB director will be replaced. And at the FDIC, Marty Grunberg was, they were waiting to replace him anyway. But I believe that FDIC board has to have, like a 3-2 split in it. So, that's interesting for appointments. It sounds like, they'll get a new OCC director. There's some things I think that are negative, you know, when we look at the Senate Banking Committee, Tester from Montana lost to Sheehy, and apparently he was a great friend to banks. So that was a big loss. For things like, you know, it may be harder to get the Safer Banking Act through with Republicans in charge. So we'll see what we're able to do. I believe that Trump supports that bill, but we'll see what happens at the federal level. I think at the state level, we can definitely say that having a divided government is great for banking. I know it is a giant relief to Teresa and myself, because nothing is going to get through that legislature that isn't moderate. They're going to need to agree on things. And so we won't see any of the kind of one-sided legislation that we have seen in the past. It also means I just don't know how much is going to get through. We were prepared for some pretty negative things to come our way. One of them is Illinois passed an interchange fee prohibition act that was backed by merchants, and that would keep banks and payment networks from charging or receiving interchange fees on taxes and tips, which of course is, I think, a really difficult thing to do, especially when it's in one state. I don't know if the technology is there for that yet. In August, the Illinois Bankers Association and the ABA and some credit union groups, they filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court asking for an injunction. They argued that this law violates the National Bank Act, the Federal Credit Union Act, and conflicts with Electronic Fund Transfer Act, and that it would throw the payment system into chaos. The OCC filed an amicus brief supporting the bankers' position on that, and there were a lot of briefs filed on that one. So there was a hearing on October 30th, and the court will decide soon whether to issue an injunction, because otherwise that law is going to go into effect on July 1st. And that's something we expected to see here. There is often talk at the state level of doing something on interchange. And so I think until this is resolved, probably we don't need to worry about it. And this session, I think it would be next to impossible for anything to pass on that. But that's something that if it doesn't go the bankers' way, that is something we could definitely see in Minnesota. Another one along those lines is the DIDMCA opt-out. We saw a bill last session that was trying to prohibit along high interest rate loans in Minnesota by opting out of DIDMCA. That's a federal law that said that state chartered banks can export their interest rates into other states. And there are banks that are partnering with fintechs that are loaning across the country using really high interest rates. I think Utah was a state that was often mentioned. And so it's meant to stop that behavior. But what it also does is if a state opts out of DIDMCA, it means that the state charter can't do as much as a national charter can. So it kind of devalues that charter. So Colorado legislature opted out of DIDMCA in 2024, and now that's in litigation. A federal district court in Colorado issued a preliminary injunction on that in June, blocking the enforcement of that Colorado law. And we did see that last session. It did not get through at the last minute. So I don't know if that will be introduced again this year. I guess it doesn't need to be introduced. I don't know if it's going to, I doubt that would go anywhere. Again, with the situation in Colorado needing to play out, and then with the divided legislature, it'd be highly unlikely. The third one that we were able to kind of put off from last session is, again, dealing with a federal law, a due on sale law, Garn-St. Germain Act. It requires mortgagees to allow assumptions of mortgages in certain situations. It's like if a homeowner dies and a family member wants to assume that mortgage, they have to be allowed to do that. So there was a state bill that would put that into state law. So it's already federal law, but there are no real penalties associated with it. And it's also kind of incorporated into RESPA provisions. But a group was looking at incorporating that into our state law and allowing a private right of action on that. So that is something that could come as well, but I think this session, there's probably really no point in them bringing it with the divided government. So when I say that divided government is good for banks, this is why we have a lot more. We'll see a lot more moderate bills this session if anyone wants to get anything done. That's about all I have on that topic. Tom's going to talk a little bit about accounts for non-US citizens.
Yes, get to the exciting topics here. Now, first, I wanted to just start off with kind of the basics. The banks are in control of who their customers are as far as what your market area is that you're going to service. So there's no, strict prohibition or requirement to offer certainly deposit accounts to non-residents of Minnesota, whether they're foreign residents or residents of another state. And it's likewise on the credits too. You have a little more complications with the fair lending rules on the credit side. Like certainly you can't use immigration status as the only reason to deny somebody credit. But if they're a non-resident of the state, have no contacts with the state outside your market area, that's certainly a reason to deny applications. And they often see banks, if they have online credit applications in particular, well, there would be a rule set up to if the person's outside the bank's market area, that it will be automatically denied, or they'll have some sort of certification up front to state, if you're in Minnesota or in whatever the defined market area is, and if they answer no, then they can't go forward in the application. So that's kind of first off. But if you have decided to go forward and offer deposit accounts, lending credit to those in other states or foreign customers. Some of the more interesting questions are with the entities, really, but we do have statutes in Minnesota that identify that merely maintaining a bank account relationship is not sufficient to require a foreign, whether it's out of state or another country entity. Most entities, corporations, LLCs, limited liability partnerships, even trust, it doesn't require them to certify with the state that they're authorized, get certification with the state that they're authorized to do business in Minnesota. It's not just maintaining that banking relationship is not enough to require them to file with the Secretary of State. So that's one good thing. Another piece, when you have non-US entities, you got also tax-related issues, whether or not they have an EIN or some sort of tax identification number from the state. And really kind of the only real direction on that comes from the BSA regulations, CIP. If you have an entity dealing with an entity and they don't have a US tax ID number, then you are required to get the other government issued documentation from the foreign country there, or whatever, certifying the existence of the business or the enterprise. And it could be other filings in the state or others where they're certified to do business. Let's see. And then the non-US individuals, a little different. You also have some tax issues there. There's plenty of resident aliens that can get a Social Security number. So if they can, they should have one. If they can't, they may still be able to get an individual tax ID number. And that applies to non-residents as well. Non-residents can get it. The I-10, the individual tax ID number, is just a reporting number. So it's anybody who has to file any tax forms with the US government, they can pretty much get an I-10, so they can do that. And kind of similar to with the BSA, if they don't have a US tax ID number, then you're required to get passport number, country of issuance. If they do have an alien identification card number, you can get that, or any other documentation that with photograph, their nationality, and their evidence of residence, any kind of government documentation showing that is good enough to get them on there. And then, kind of circling back, non-Minnesota individuals, obviously there's no prohibition on there as well, but it could be something where it possibly raises up BSA concerns if it's outside your market area and they don't have contacts with the bank's market area, just to make sure why they're going with your bank. And another thing that comes up too on occasion, Minnesota has a requirement if you're a new resident or you move within the state, you're supposed to apply for your driver's license within 60 days, or if you have a commercial driver's license, it's only 30 days. But that's not something that bankers have to enforce, certainly. But it's something good to know. Occasionally, you might get a question. Direct them to the Department of Public Safety for information on drivers and vehicle services. But it's good to have that information just in case. But that was most of what I had to say there. It's like there's one question. Was that?
Yeah, there's a question about whether we have a flow chart on the topic. We do
We
not.
don't have a flow chart, but that's not a bad idea. If you do
Yeah,
compliance
about
companion or something like that along
Yeah.
those lines. Another thing that comes up too, not really related to foreign individuals necessarily, but a POA, a power of attorney in Minnesota. It doesn't have to be drafted under Minnesota statute. It could be from a surrounding state, could be from a foreign country, as long as it's validly established in that whatever jurisdiction, it's still effective in Minnesota. Obviously, as a banker, you have no idea if there's a POA from France, whether it's validly produced in France, but you're allowed to assume validity when people sign. So
I think I had a question recently about like a personal rep I think it was a person who lived in Minnesota. They had a safe deposit box here, and the personal rep was out of state. And I think they didn't want to come here. They wanted to assign someone, kind of delegate that authority, but kind of went down a rabbit hole on what an out-of-state personal rep can do when part of the estate is here.
yeah, I think since they're court appointed, I think they would have to get something from the court to say
Yeah,
what they can or cannot do. If they can, even if they could apply, assign an attorney in fact at all, they may be prohibited, court certainly. But
yeah, I think they would need to go to the Minnesota court to have authority here.
yeah.
There was just a comment about check systems. I'm not sure what he meant by that, though. Just check systems, question mark. Is that check
Yes.
systems for non-US citizens, maybe?
Yeah, if there's no results, certainly it's not verifying non-citizens. Yeah, if there's no file available to check, you may just get a non-result back, and that would kind of satisfy the transaction account requirement in state law to do that check if they've had anything closed involuntarily. If you come back with a non-result, you've done your verification.
Yeah. Something that came up with Teresa is groups sometimes want to put into state law that banks have to bank non-US citizens. So that just came up last session. Fortunately, they were unable to find a bank that wouldn't do it already. And so we were able to say, there's no problem here. But it is something that comes up. I think they were able to find some credit unions that didn't,
Yeah.
but no banks. But as
Yeah,
you said, it is a choice, obviously.
Yeah, it is choice. Yeah, I typically get the question kind of the other way: do we have to open one from a non-citizen?
A lot of times
but
it's lending, right? And when you have collateral that, like a car, for example, and someone doesn't live or may not stay in the area, I guess is the concern.
right. Yep, and you kind of have even within state boundaries on the credit side, you may have issues collecting property on, say, tribal land, as well.
Yeah,
Adds in a wrinkle as well, even with, obviously US citizens, but on sovereign land, it can be have some problems repossessing collateral.
yeah. I think CFPB put something out last year, didn't they, about banking non-US citizens, and they did recognize the issue with collateral that it does present a risk.
Yeah, that was kind of mentioned briefly. So you can't use immigration status alone as the only reason to deny credit, but it can certainly be a factor as part of your underwriting. So they kind of want you to do additional steps beyond just saying, well, you're non-citizens, we won't lend to you. You make other steps and make other notes in your file if you do deny what the reasons are. So.
Okay. Well, I think that's it for questions, Tom. Tom and I are here. If you have questions, email us at legal@minbankers.com. Also, if you have any ideas for things you want us to talk about on Minnesota Matters, you could just send it right there or reach out to us directly. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hope to see you next time. Bye.